Hey everyone, welcome to last week's movies, the inaugural episode with me, Zane Simon. Most of you will know me from my work over at Bloody Elbow, MMA stuff, all that. But beyond face punching, I am also uh, I was gonna say registered cinephile, but that sounds really inappropriate. So, a movie buff, a film fanatic, whatever you want to say. Um, I watch a lot of movies all the time, other than people fighting each other. That's pretty much all I do. And so I want to do a little podcast because one of the things I've been working on, one of my big projects in my film watching, is to try and build a collection of 1,000 movies. These are all movies that I can watch anytime, throw on, enjoy. I know that sounds like a lot, but there've been like a million movies made out there. It can't be that hard to find 1,000 of them that I really like. Um, it's still taking a long time. I'm doing it by watching like 4 to 6 movies every week. I plan it all out a year ahead of time, and every week I find the movies that are next on my list, watch them, and find out if any of them are good enough that I want to see them again. And if I want to see them again, then I'll make a note to watch this again in the near future, and then if I watch it again and I really like it, I'll buy a copy, and thus you see my collection, at least part of it, behind me. I've got about 700 and something odd total at the moment, so I'm not that far off the 1,000 movie goal, but that last 300 probably a few years away. Anyway, I'm going to start out this opening list, or this opening show, with my movies that I watched in the last week. Uh, and those being Blade of the Immortal, the 2017 Takeshi Miike movie, his 100th film, I believe. Classic Western from 1959, No Name on the Bullet. Classic rom-com from 1963, The Thrill of It All. The recent Marvel comic book movie, Doctor Strange. The crime drama thriller classic from the 90s, The Grifters, and the miniseries presented by Oliver Stone, Wild Palms, also from the 90s. So first off, I'm going to start this out with Blade of the Immortal because that's like the newest, most interesting thing that people ask me about and I got feedback on when I posted my list on Twitter and all that stuff, so I figured I'd jump in right with that. And I'm going to start out by saying that I am not the world's biggest Takeshi Miike fan, and that opinion has not been dramatically changed by Blade of the Immortal. Miike belongs to sort of a film tradition in Japan starting in the 60s, really growing and taking off in the 70s and continuing on from there, of sort of narrative deconstructuralism. I'd want to say a lot of his movies are very unfocused in terms of plot or in terms of strict narrative adherence or interest in even developing a narrative necessarily. A lot of times there will be a central theme or a series of events that are all related and you can see the connections between them, and they're not like way out there, but it just isn't necessarily gripped by the need to tell a tightly constructed story. Blade of the Immortal is kind of his, a lot of people talked about it, and even he talked about it as like his, like, or I believe he's talked about it as sort of, he wanted to make something that wasn't so violent, which is absurd because it is a movie where hundreds of people get killed in samurai battles. So I'm not even really sure about that whole quote, but a lot of people have talked about it as like, his proof that he could make a narratively direct, straightforward movie. And it's a port of a long-running manga, or a classic manga series by Hiroaki Samura. I'm not familiar with the manga series, so I can't tell you how strictly it adheres to that or anything like that at all. but it definitely does feel like a attempt to narrow down a very large volume of work into a 2 hour and 20-minute time frame. The sort of, it kind of opens with this samurai and this getting attached to this little girl who wants him to be her bodyguard, and he's got these weird blood worms that make it so he can regenerate from injuries, and it kind of ends up feeling a lot like the Japanese Logan, with the unkillable regenerating bodyguard and his violent little girl cohort, although she's not nearly as violent as the little girl from Logan. And it's got a lot of cool stuff. And I mean, I will say first and foremost that the last like 20 to 30 minutes of Blade of the Immortal are really cool. It's basically just one huge, prolonged, ultra violent battle. But the lead up to it, it kind of feels like if this is his attempt to tell a more straightforward, strict story, it doesn't. It's like, well, this is just kind of really boring and cheesy and sentimental, and a lot of characters. It just like there's especially a scene where I'm not going to get too far into it, but the main character, Manji, is about to get killed by this woman, and she's cut off one of his arms, and he's like laying against a post and all that. And then suddenly she's just like breaks down crying. Is like, sometimes I always come around and realize what I'm doing and how horrible and violent it is. And I just can't live with myself. And then she runs off, and that's kind of it. And you're just like, well, that's really fucking convenient. So Blade of the Immortal, super fun in its closing act, but otherwise not a movie I would for 2 hours and 20 minutes. It's got some fun action, but it's not really the kind of, for somebody like me who's very into plot and plot driven film, it's not the kind of thing that I would ever probably revisit. It's the kind of movie that lends itself more to like, check out this amazing sequence in a highlight video on YouTube, rather than sit through the whole movie and really relish how good it is. Because yeah, it's fine. It's mostly just fine for its cinematography and action set pieces, and the rest of it is can be totally left alone. Um. Oh, I guess I should also. I'll give a star system. I like to do things on like a 1 to 5 rating, with based on how easily I would recommend movies, because how much I like them, it's all very subjective. And I really I enjoy a lot of shit that nobody else is gonna really like that much. But ease of recommendation seems to fit a lot more to me. Just how easily would I tell any random person I met to watch a movie? 5 being like, oh my god, I will strap you to a chair and pry your eyes open and make you watch this movie with me, to anybody. And 1 being, don't ever, don't even speak its name in an empty room. So Blade of the Immortal's a 3.5, which is kind of my, like, this is almost really accessible to everyone, but the narrative, the thinness of the narrative, and the translation from manga and all that, it's not a movie that everybody's going to pick up and enjoy. It's certainly going to have some hardcore fan love from people who are really into Japanese cinema and who are really into Takeshi Miike and manga and ultra violent samurai movies. So but it's a 3.5 for me. Next up, No Name on the Bullet from 1959, directed by Jack Arnold, who a lot of people will know as the director of This Island Earth, I believe, if I've got that right. The very mostly famous as the Mystery Science Theater. Did I have that wrong? No, I may have that wrong. Damn it! I thought he directed This Island Earth. Did he? No, I must have got that wrong. Never mind. He directed It Came from Outer Space and The Incredible Shrinking Man, and other things. I don't know where I got that. So that just goes to show that sometimes I'm full of shit. Um. Anyway, a B movie director for the most part of like sci-fi pulp and other just sort of pulpy B 50s 60s movies. No Name on the Bullet is kind of a standout. Just in general is like a cult classic kind of a cult classic western, and watching it, it's not hard to see why. It's a movie that is a very interesting, kind of strange setup about an infamous gunslinger played by Audie Murphy, who, you know, I'm sure he's been in other things that I've seen, but is not an actor that I otherwise recognize. But a gunslinger who comes to town, an infamous gunslinger, and everybody knows that his method of working is that he goes and he sort of insinuates himself into the community until he can start a fight with somebody, and then he kills them in that fight, and everybody says he's justified because it was the other guy drew first. So everybody in this town is just waiting to find out who he's going to pick a fight with and kill, and everybody starts to suspect one another of having hired him to settle all the different feuds running in the background of the town's day-to-day life and all that. And it's an interesting sort of dramatic psychological thriller western, and this idea of everybody kind of constantly paranoid about who this gunslinger is coming after. It's also really obviously underwritten, so that like the plot's really interesting, the setup's interesting, the acting is it's a 50s pulpy kind of movie, and the actual dialogue, often you just get these like segue non sequiturs where they'll be having a heated conversation about the potential for him to come out and you know commit murder or something, and somebody will be like, "Oh, you want some coffee? Yeah, I'll have a cup." And the writing often fails the movie in terms of how well it's carried. Still not a bad Western. Definitely worth seeing if you really love Westerns and love classic Westerns, especially. It definitely sticks out as its own kind of weird thing in a genre mostly full of black hat, white hat kind of showdowns. Still kind of, I mean, it ends up for very different reasons, very much being a 3.5 for me as well. A movie that is something I'd recommend more than just to hardcore Western enthusiasts, but not a movie that I would just go out and tell everybody like, oh, you have to see No Name on the Bullet. If you love classic pulpy Westerns, yeah, check it out. It's worth seeing. After that, I watched 1963 rom-com The Thrill of It All, which Doris Day, James Garner, directed by Norman Jewison, who, let's see, I'm trying to, directed things like Fist and Rollerball and Moonstruck, of all things, later on, and The Cincinnati Kid, The Russians Are Coming, a lot of different, the Thomas Crown Affair, the classic 1968 one with Steve McQueen. So definitely a pretty notable director, and so not somebody who I've watched a lot of his movies. I've seen Moonstruck. I love Moonstruck a lot, but not. I didn't get to this movie through Norman Jewison. Mostly I got to it through my interest in watching more classic romances and comedies, and my love of Doris Day as a rom-com actor. I think she's pretty fantastic, and it's an insidiously fun movie. It's a very, it's about this housewife who gets a job pitching soap for a local or for a soap company, and it slowly kind of ruins her job ruins her marriage basically. And it's funny and it's enjoyable and it's a lighthearted rom-com. It's also super insidiously like classic anti-feminist values of like, oh, you got a job and having a job is ruining your life, and oh, it's making you rich and you make more money than your husband and everything. Like it's a obviously easy job and all that, but your husband, he's a doctor and his work is actually important, and if you really valued your family, you quit and go back home. And it has some like pushback to that, where Doris Day, the James Garner's character, like he wrote some stuff in a newsletter or in a publication about how women should be out of the home and have jobs and all that. But there's even a scene where she throws that in his face. Is like, yeah, well, it's not, doesn't mean you. And eventually she comes around to that idea too. So a fun rom com, but also the kind of movie where you, by the end of it, you're like, really, the fuck. This is gonna sound kind of dumb, but it's very much a 3.5 movie for me too. Not a movie I would necessarily recommend to anyone, just because it's kind of insidiously misogynistic, but a really fun, lighthearted movie if you're into classic rom-coms. Nothing wrong with it. I'll say this last week, I'm gonna be kind of repetitive on my ratings because this last week didn't really give me anything I loved. Um, After that, I watched Doctor Strange, 2016 Marvel movie. I'm not a huge Marvel fan. I'm not a huge comic book movie fan at all. I wanted to see this one because I'd heard a lot of people talk about how great the visual feel of it was and how much of a treat it was to see. And I probably should have seen it in the big screen to get more of that effect, but I didn't really care about the Marvel Cinematic Universe at all, so I skipped it at the time it came out. And eventually seeing it down the road, it was fine. It was perfectly okay. Um, Benedict Cumberbatch was fine. Chiwetel Ejiofor, I don't know if that's how you actually pronounce his name. Whatever, he was fine. Tilda Swinton was great. Rachel McAdams was fine. Um, I really liked Mads Mikkelsen as a villain. My biggest problem was probably that the main ultra villain that's always lurking in the background of these Marvel movies, that they can make more of them. I can't remember what the name of the evil main villain is. Whatever, the Ancient One. No, the Ancient One's Tilda Swinton. Whatever the name of the main evil that lurks in the shadows was. His planet devouring interstellar shadow realm kind of looked like anal beads. That was my main takeaway. Other than that, it looked good. It was very paint by numbers Marvel, and yeah, like a 3.5. If you like Marvel movies, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it at all. If you don't, it's more the same. Uh, Then I watched The Grifters, 1990 John Cusack movie directed by Stephen Frears, who I have a major soft spot for as the director of one of my all-time favorite movies in his one of his very first theatrical releases after doing a ton of TV movies. The Hit. I love The Hit a ton. It's a classic with starring uh, Terrence Stamp and um, William, or no, Terrence Stamp and John Hurt and Tim Roth and Fernando Rey. Great, hitman sort of, contemplative hitman movie. I don't know, but anyway, I will always have a huge soft spot for Stephen Frears for that. I also really enjoy his version of Three Men in a Boat that he did from 1975, which has Tim Curry, Michael Palin in it. It's a classic British sort of 20s era novel, I believe, very reminiscent of Jeeves and Wooster. The Grifters, though, it kind of surprised me. I didn't know what to expect going in. I think because it's John Cusack, early 90s era John Cusack, I just automatically assumed it would be a comedy. And, John Cusack, Angelica Houston, Annette Bening, fantastic cast. They really shine. But I'm kind of shocked this isn't a David Mamet movie. Feels exactly like a David Mamet movie. Very stagey, very clipped dialogue, very grim in unexpected ways, while also feeling sort of lighthearted because of its weird tone. I like some stuff David Mamet's done. A lot of David Mamet stuff I find just kind of too dark and grim for me to really enjoy rewatching. The Grifters is very much that way too. By the time it kind of, and not to compare it to Blade of the Immortal, but Grifters really feels like it really tightens itself and gets to its dramatic, gets on solid dramatic footing in its last half hour. But by the time it gets there, I don't really care that much. I didn't really care that much anymore. The opening setup of it is really fun, seeing how everybody plays their cons and all that. But then it just kind of feels really grim, and you're kind of wallowing in the grimness of these people's terrible lives as two-bit con artists. And there's some fun parts to that. It's not like just all downer, and it's certainly not a poorly made movie, but it's the kind of movie that I just emotionally checked out of because it's just all like, this is just really dark and cold, and it doesn't get any less dark and cold as it goes on. Not a movie, not a bad movie, but not a movie I particularly enjoyed. Probably, honestly, a 4, just as a movie that I think anybody could and should see. There's nothing wrong with The Grifters. It's a well acted, well written, well filmed movie. It's a downer. And honestly, as sad as it seems, as sort of a commentary on my own taste, as it seems, it's not really what I show up for in film. It's not to say everything I watch is happy, but the things I watch that are depressing tend to need to be depressing for a good reason. And The Grifters doesn't feel like it has a really good reason to be as depressing as it is. Finally, watched Wild Palms, the TV miniseries from 1993, produced by Oliver Stone, and I checked out of it and stopped watching it halfway through the first episode. It feels like the bad episodes of it feels like the middle 2/5 of the original season of Twin Peaks, kind of when you could feel like it felt like David Lynch didn't really have a solid hand in it anymore, and they'd already solved the initial Laura Palmer killing, and they were wandering around with that guy who collected orchids, and there was some shit about her diary, and you're just like, man, I really have to slog through this for that last 1/5 for the show to get good again. And Wild Palms really feels like that. Very, very much dating itself to a 90s vibe. Jim Belushi is not a captivating straight man lead. And maybe the show gets better. I liked Angie Dickinson in it. I like Kim Cattrall in it. Robert Loggia seemed like he had an interesting part to take on. But And I didn't actually probably didn't watch long enough to get to the David Warner parts, who I actually like David Warner quite a bit. But honestly, after like 45 minutes, an hour of watching, because the first episode's like a double episode, so it's an hour and a half long. After the first hour, I just couldn't care. And to put up with 4 more hours of it, uh, I wasn't gonna do it. So I'd give that a solid 3. Um, a show that you should really only watch if you've got strong connections to those actors or to the material or to a really strong interest in it that makes you want to see it. Otherwise, it feels like a very dated product of a very odd style of directing that really only somebody like David Lynch can pull off, and trying to parrot it for a TV miniseries like this without the real sort of strong ties to what makes David Lynch so fun and weird, it just feels weak. So next week I will be reviewing uh I should know this, An Actor's Revenge and The Abyss. And I'm trying to pull up my list really quickly. I should have had this better. Pushover, Baby Doll, 310 to Yuma, the classic original one, and Death on the Nile. So, everyone, if you enjoyed this, give it a like, thumbs up down below, subscribe to my YouTube channel, all that stuff that everybody else tells you to do, which helps way more than you think it does. And join me next time for my next episode of Last Week's Movies.